April 11, 1981, a quiet morning in a small mountain town in California. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The birds were singing, the sun had just begun to rise, and the peaceful silence of the forest surrounded the tiny community of Keddie. But inside Cabin 28, something unimaginable had happened. 3 bodies were discovered in the living room, brutally murdered, tied, and left behind in a scene so disturbing that even experienced investigators were shaken. And yet, in the middle of this nightmare, some people in the house were completely unharmed. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear suspects, and even more chilling, evidence that suggested the killers may have known the victims. As the investigation unfolded, secrets began to surface, whispers of betrayal, hidden relationships, and a truth that someone didn't want to be found. Over 40 years later, the case remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. What really happened inside Cabin 28? Who was responsible, and how did they disappear without a trace? This is the story of the Keddie Cabin Murders. Keddie, California, April 10, 1981. Hidden deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains, the small resort town of Keddie was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. People left their doors unlocked. Kids played outside until late. Everyone knew everyone. It felt safe. Inside Cabin 28, the Sharp family was settling in for the night. Sue Sharp, a single mother of 5, had recently moved there hoping for a fresh start. Life hadn't been easy for her, but Keddie seemed like the perfect place to rebuild, quiet, peaceful, far away from the problems she left behind. That night, Sue wasn't alone. In the cabin were her children, John, Sheila, Rick, Greg, and little Tina. Also staying over was John's friend, Dana Wingate. It was supposed to be a normal evening. Laughing, talking, maybe a late movie before bed. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would hint at what was about to happen. At some point during the night, Sheila left the cabin to stay with a neighbor, just a short walk away. It was a small, ordinary decision, one that would unknowingly save her life. Back in Cabin 28, the lights eventually went out. The forest outside grew silent. And sometime in the darkness, someone entered the cabin. No one heard a struggle. No one called for help. No one in the nearby cabins reported anything unusual. But inside those thin wooden walls, something terrifying was unfolding. Something violent. Something personal. And by the time the sun rose over Keddie the next morning, nothing would ever be the same. What exactly happened inside Cabin 28 that night, and who was responsible? That's where the mystery truly begins. Morning came quietly to Keddie. The sun rose over the mountains, casting a warm light across the small cabins. It should have been just another peaceful day. Around 7:45 a.m., Sheila returned to Cabin 28. At first, nothing seemed out of place. But the moment she stepped inside, everything changed. The living room was in chaos. Furniture overturned. Broken glass scattered across the floor. And then, the sight that would haunt her forever. 3 bodies. Sue Sharp, her son John, and Dana Wingate lay on the floor, bound with electrical cords and tape. The scene was brutal, violent, far beyond anything this quiet town had ever seen. It didn't look like a simple crime. It looked like something personal. Something filled with rage. Panicked, Sheila ran outside screaming for help. Neighbors rushed over, unable to believe what they were seeing. Within minutes, the small, peaceful resort turned into a crime scene. But then, something even more disturbing was discovered. Inside the cabin, in a separate bedroom, 3 children, Rick, Greg, and a friend, were found alive. They had slept through everything. Through the violence. Through the chaos. Through the murders happening just rooms away. And even more chilling, 8-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. No signs of where she went. No clear evidence of a struggle leading outside. It was as if she had simply vanished. Police quickly arrived, trying to piece together what had happened. But right from the start, things didn't make sense. There were no clear fingerprints. No forced entry. And evidence that suggested the killers may have stayed inside the cabin longer than expected. Watching. Waiting. Maybe even after the murders were done. As fear spread through Keddie, one question echoed louder than anything else. Was this a random attack, or did someone out there know exactly what they were doing? And more importantly, where was Tina? Within hours, Cabin 28 was surrounded by police. Detectives moved carefully through the scene, trying to understand what had happened inside those walls. But the more they looked, the stranger it became. There were signs of a violent struggle, cords, tape, and personal items scattered across the room. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean. Whoever did this took their time. But then came the first major problem. The crime scene had already been contaminated. Before police arrived, multiple neighbors had entered the cabin. People had walked through the living room, unknowingly disturbing critical evidence. Whatever clues were left behind, many of them were now lost. Still, investigators managed to find something disturbing. A hammer and a knife were recovered near the scene, possible weapons. But neither clearly pointed to a suspect. And then, there was the question that refused to go away: why were some people in the cabin left alive? Rick and Greg had been sleeping in a nearby bedroom, just feet away from everything that happened. So had their friend, yet they were untouched. It didn't make sense. Unless, the killers had a specific target. As detectives began interviewing locals, whispers started spreading through Keddie. People talked about arguments, about tension, about certain individuals who had been seen near the cabin that night. Names began to surface, but every lead seemed to hit a dead end. No arrests, no clear suspect, and no sign of Tina Sharp. Days turned into weeks, and the case only grew colder. But behind the scenes, investigators were starting to focus on a theory: this wasn't random. Whoever did this likely knew the victims. And maybe they were still in Keddie, watching, waiting, and making sure the truth never came. As the investigation continued, detectives became more certain of one thing: this was not a random crime. Someone knew the Sharp family. Someone had been inside Cabin 28 before. And soon, attention began to focus on a few individuals. Two names stood out more than the others. Men who were known in Keddie. Men who had connections to Sue Sharp. Men who, according to some witnesses, had been near the cabin around the time of the murders. At first, the evidence seemed to point in their direction. Witness statements, rumors of arguments, strange behavior after the crime. One of them reportedly left town shortly after the murders. The other gave statements that didn't quite add up. But despite the suspicion, nothing was solid enough. No arrests were made, no charges filed, and as time passed, something even more troubling began to surface. Reports of mishandled evidence, important leads that were never fully followed, information that may have been ignored, or even hidden. Some believed the case was simply too complex. Others believed something darker, that someone, somewhere, didn't want the truth to come out. Then came a chilling twist. Years later, new information suggested that one of the main suspects may have confessed, but the confession was never properly pursued. If that was true, then the answer had been there all along. Hidden, ignored, or deliberately buried. Meanwhile, Tina Sharp was still missing. No trace, no answers. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. But that wouldn't last forever. Because what investigators would discover years later would reopen the entire nightmare. And prove that the story of Cabin 28 was far from over. The chilling discovery: for years, there was nothing. No trace of Tina Sharp. No answers. Just silence. The case of Cabin 28 slowly began to fade, becoming another unsolved mystery whispered about in small towns and late-night conversations. But then, 3 years later, everything changed. In 1984, far from Keddie, a shocking discovery was made. In a remote area, investigators found human remains. When they were finally identified, the truth hit hard: they belonged to Tina Sharp. After years of searching, her fate was finally confirmed. But instead of bringing closure, it only raised more questions. How did she end up so far away? Why was she taken? And what happened in those final moments after she left Cabin 28? Back in Keddie, fear returned. This wasn't just a brutal crime anymore. It was something deeper, something more disturbing. The fact that Tina had been taken from the cabin, alive, meant one thing: whoever committed the murders didn't just act in rage. They had a plan. And even more terrifying, they had time. Investigators revisited old evidence, old suspects, old theories. But the same problems remained. Missing pieces, lost evidence, mistakes that could never be undone. The truth felt close, but always just out of reach. And as the years passed, one question continued to haunt everyone connected to the case: If the killers were capable of something like this, how did they manage to disappear so completely? Or worse, did they ever really leave? Decades passed. The cabins in Keddie grew older. Some were abandoned, others were torn down. But the story of Cabin 28 never truly disappeared. For years, it remained a cold case. Until new investigators decided to take another look. In the 2000s, fresh eyes began reviewing the evidence, and what they found was disturbing. Important reports had been overlooked. Key witness statements were never fully followed. And some pieces of evidence had simply gone missing. But then came a breakthrough. A recording surfaced. In it, a woman claimed that her ex-husband had confessed to being involved in the murders. She spoke about details that had never been made public, details only someone connected to the crime could know. Investigators started digging deeper. Old suspects were brought back into focus. Connections between them became clearer. And for the first time in years, the case felt alive again. Then, another shocking detail emerged. A hammer believed to be linked to the crime was discovered near the original scene, something that should have been found decades earlier. How had it been missed? Or, had it been there all along? The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This case hadn't just gone cold. It had been mishandled, possibly from the very beginning. And now, with many of the original suspects either gone or unable to speak, time itself had become the biggest obstacle. But even after all these years, one thing remained certain: the truth was still there. Hidden in the past, waiting for someone to finally piece it all together. Because the story of the Keddie Cabin Murders was never really over. Today, nothing remains of Cabin 28. It was demolished years after the murders, as if erasing the place could somehow erase what happened inside it. But the truth is, some stories don't disappear. They linger. They echo. And in Keddie, people still remember. They remember the quiet town that was forever changed overnight. They remember the unanswered questions. And they remember the feeling that something was never fully uncovered. Over the years, theories have come and gone. Some believe the killers were known all along. Others think the truth was lost due to mistakes, or something more deliberate. And some are convinced that the full story is still hidden, buried somewhere in old evidence, forgotten reports, or memories people chose not to share. But no matter what you believe, one fact remains: no one has ever been officially brought to justice. And that's what makes this case so haunting. Not just the crime itself, but the silence that followed. Because somewhere out there, at least at one point in time, someone knew exactly what happened inside Cabin 28. Someone walked away, and someone stayed silent. So the question is, if the truth was this close all along, why was it never truly revealed? And after all these years, would we even recognize it if we finally saw it? This was the story of the Keddie Cabin Murders. A mystery that refuses to fade. A night that refuses to be forgotten. And a truth, still waiting in the shadows.